Welcome back to LexTalks, Legal Topics Simplified. You know the drill. Taking tough legal concepts, especially those relevant to you, our amazing Indian law students, and breaking them down.
Simplifying them, making them clear.
Exactly. And today, we're diving deep into a topic that can be, well, a little tangled. International Humanitarian Law.
IHL for
Right,
short.
IHL. And its relationship with International Human Rights Law, IHRL.
It can feel like a dense legal jungle out there, but we're here to give you the tools to navigate it.
I love that. A compass and a map for the legal wilderness. Now, I know you've all encountered human rights in your studies. Freedom of speech, the rights to education, protection from torture,
The fundamentals.
the things we often take for granted.
And those rights are really the bedrock of a just society. They're considered universal, fundamental, applying to everyone, no matter your nationality, ethnicity, or anything else.
Okay, so that's the baseline. But then we step into the arena of armed conflict, and things get complicated. That's where IHL comes in, right?
Precisely. IHL, sometimes called the law of war, regulates conduct during these armed conflicts. Its main goal is to minimize human suffering and protect those not directly fighting.
So we've got these two systems, IHRL for peacetime, IHL for wartime. But isn't that a bit redundant? Couldn't we just have one set of laws that covers everything?
That's where it gets interesting, really. While both aim to protect human dignity ultimately, they work in different situations with different focuses. IHRL sets the standard for how states treat individuals all the time. But IHL recognizes that armed conflict creates a very different environment. Sometimes normal rules can't fully apply.
It's like switching from regular traffic laws to, I don't know, a demolition derby. The rules change when things get chaotic. But what happens when these two systems clash? Like, what about detention without trial? IHL might allow it in conflict zones, but it's a huge problem under IHRL. How do we reconcile those?
Excellent question. It's a perfect example of the challenge. This is where legal experts bring in the concept of lex specialis. It means that in specific situations, a more specific law, IHL in this case, takes precedence.
So it's not about one law being better, but more about choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly. Both IHL and IHRL are crucial tools in the international legal toolbox. How they're used depends on the specific context. Sometimes they work together, other times there's friction.
Okay, so can you give us a real-world example of this in action? Where have we seen IHL and IHRL either working together or bumping heads?
There are some landmark cases that illustrate this. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, actually looked at IHRL principles when interpreting IHL in its opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons.
Wow, so even in a situation as extreme as nuclear war, human rights still have a place.
Absolutely. The court said that even in war, some fundamental rights, like the right to life, can't be ignored. It was a delicate balance, weighing a state's right to defend itself under IHL against the right to life protected by IHRL.
That's powerful. It shows IHL and IHRL aren't just isolated systems. They're part of a larger framework to protect human dignity, even in the toughest situations.
Precisely. But sometimes that protection comes with compromises. Take, for instance, the Israeli Supreme Court's decision on building a barrier in occupied Palestinian territory. The court ended up prioritizing IHL's less strict obligations over certain human rights concerns.
So in that case, the court said that the specific situation, the security concerns, and the legal framework of occupation outweighed those human rights concerns.
Yes, and it sparked a lot of debate, showing how complicated and sometimes controversial it is to apply these two frameworks together. There's rarely an easy answer.
This all makes sense, but it raises another question. We've mainly talked about governments and courts. What about non-state actors, like rebel groups or private military companies? Do these laws apply to them?
That's a crucial point. IHL applies to both state and non-state actors in armed conflict. So yes, rebel groups and private military companies are bound by IHL even if the application is less straightforward.
Less straightforward. How? If they haven't formally signed international treaties, how can they be bound by IHL?
Well, they may not have signed specific documents, but they're still bound by what's called customary international law. These are rules that come from consistent state practice where everyone generally accepts certain actions as legally binding. So even if a rebel group hasn't signed the Geneva Conventions, they're still expected to uphold the basic IHL principles, like not targeting civilians or torture.
So it's like an unwritten code of conduct for anyone involved in a conflict.
Exactly. And it's especially important because we see more and more non-state actors involved in conflicts globally.
And what about individual responsibility? Can individuals within these groups be held accountable for violations even if they were following orders?
Absolutely. The idea of individual criminal responsibility is central to both IHL and IHRL. Individuals can be held accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity no matter who they're with or if they were following orders. It's a core principle of international justice, aiming to ensure accountability and prevent future atrocities.
It's amazing how this idea of individual responsibility comes up, even in the middle of a conflict. It really highlights how important these legal frameworks are. But I'm curious, shifting gears a bit for our Indian law students listening, how does all of this relate to them? I mean, we usually think of IHL as dealing with international conflicts, right?
That's a common thought, for sure. But it's crucial to remember that IHL has big implications for Indian law and practice, even beyond those international conflicts. Actually, did you know that India is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions?
Oh, yeah. Of course, I knew that. But how does being a signatory actually make a difference on the ground here in India?
It means that India has promised to uphold those Geneva Conventions principles, and they've even put some of those principles into their own laws, like the Geneva Conventions Act of 1960.
So it's not just something theoretical that we learn about in textbooks. It has real effects on how things actually work in India.
Exactly. Look at the Indian Armed Forces, for example. They have to follow IHL not only in international conflicts, but also in internal disturbances, meaning they have to stick to principles like distinction, telling the difference between combatants and civilians, and proportionality when using force, and avoiding causing unnecessary suffering, even when dealing with threats to their own security.
Interesting. So even in domestic law enforcement, those IHR principles can come into play.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just the military, too. Lawyers, judges, policymakers in India, they all need a solid understanding of IHL and how it affects all sorts of things, like how prisoners are treated, how law enforcement uses force, even the legal framework for fighting terrorism.
Wow, I see what you mean. IHL isn't just some tiny area of international law then. It's much bigger, especially for a country like India with so many different security challenges.
You got it. And it's not just about memorizing specific laws or rules, it's about understanding the principles behind them, the ethical parts, the potential human cost of any conflict. These principles can help legal professionals navigate tricky situations and advocate for protecting human dignity no matter how tough things get.
That makes a lot of sense. If it feels like having this international perspective is more and more important for legal professionals in India, no matter what kind of law they specialize in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's not enough to just know domestic law anymore. You need a global view in today's world.
Okay, so we've covered how IHL plays a part in India, but we also talked about how IHL and IHRL can seem to contradict each other sometimes. For our listeners trying to make sense of these complex frameworks, what are the key things to remember?
Well, first and foremost, keep in mind that both IHL and IHRL are ultimately about protecting human dignity. They want to minimize suffering, keep vulnerable populations safe, and uphold certain basic rights, even in the toughest situations.
So it's like drawing a line, saying even in war, there are limits, rules we can't just ignore.
You got it. The second important point is that these legal frameworks aren't set in stone. They're always changing, always being interpreted, always shaped by what's happening politically, socially, and even with new technology.
So lawyers can't just learn this once and be done. They need to keep learning and adapting how they understand the law.
Absolutely. And the last thing, and this might be the most important, is to remember IHL and IHRL aren't just abstract theories. They have real effects, touching people's lives in big ways. Understanding these laws, how they apply in real life, can literally be the difference between life or death, justice, or getting away with terrible things in conflicts all over the world.
It's kind of heavy to think about the weight these frameworks carry, how they can have such a direct impact on people's lives. But the world is changing so fast. What does the future hold for IHL and IHRL? Especially with new kinds of conflict popping up, like terrorism and cyber warfare, that don't fit neatly into the old categories.
That's the big question, isn't it? It gets at some of the biggest challenges for IHL today. One huge hurdle is how it applies to those non-state actors, those terrorist groups in particular. These groups often operate completely outside of normal legal systems. It makes it really tough to hold them accountable for breaking IHL rules.
It seems almost impossible to enforce these rules when you're dealing with groups that don't even care about the international legal system.
That's the challenge right there. And then you have the crazy speed of technological advancements. How does IHL keep up with things like drones, weapon systems that operate on their own, cyber warfare? They raise a whole bunch of new legal and ethical questions.
Sounds like IHL is always playing catch-up with how war is actually happening now. But that also shows how vital it is for legal experts to break down these challenges and figure out how to keep the law relevant, to keep protecting human dignity in this fast-changing world.
Exactly. And it can't just be legal experts working alone either. It's about getting policymakers, those civil society organizations, and even the general public involved. So everyone understands IHL better, understands why it's so important for creating a more humane world.
It feels like spreading awareness, getting people talking about this, is key to making sure these frameworks can actually deal with the messiness of modern conflict.
Yeah.
From your view, though, what stands out as the biggest challenge facing IHL and IHRL right now?
One of the most worrying trends, I think, is how the lines are blurring between war and peace. More and more, we're seeing situations that don't fit into those traditional categories of armed conflict. This makes it hard to decide which legal framework applies. Is it IHL? Is it IHRL? And that can create gaps in protection for people caught in these gray areas.
Can you give an example of what you mean by these gray zones? Something concrete?
Take the situation in Afghanistan, for instance. For over 20 years, it was classified as an armed conflict. But then international forces withdrew, the Taliban took over, and things got a lot more complicated. Now you have a mix of political instability, violence from insurgents, and a huge humanitarian crisis. It's really hard to say for sure whether IHL or IHRL should be the main legal framework in such a fluid and multi-layered situation.
So this ambiguity creates a real dilemma. How can we be sure people are protected when it's so unclear which rules apply?
That is the million-dollar question. When the legal framework is shaky, it creates space for people to get away with things. It becomes harder to hold those who commit human rights abuses accountable, and it leaves civilians more open to violence and exploitation.
It really highlights how these complex situations aren't just abstract legal problems, they have a real impact on people's lives. For our listeners who are just beginning their legal journey, what advice would you give them as they start exploring the world of IHL and IHRL? I always tell students, be curious, think critically, and get involved. Read everything you can, seek out different perspectives, and don't shy away from challenging what you think you know. This field is constantly evolving, so be ready to adapt and keep learning all through your legal career.
It's not just memorizing laws and principles, it's a constant process of learning and analyzing.
Exactly. And don't forget, while we're talking about international law, these concepts directly affect Indian law and practice too. As you go deeper into IHL and IHRL, consider what it means for India, for our region, even for the world.
It's seeing how connected it all is, right? How something that seems like a distant conflict or legal framework far away can actually have real effects closer to home.
That's the key. We live in a globalized world, and the law is part of that.
So to bring it all together, we've been exploring the fascinating, sometimes challenging, connection between international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We've looked at how they work in tandem, where they might clash, and why understanding this is so crucial, especially for future legal pros like you guys. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's a vast field with a lot of complexity and nuance, but it's also full of possibilities, especially for those who care about justice, human rights, and truly making a difference in the world.
As you keep studying, keep these questions in mind. How do we protect people best in a world where the lines between war and peace are getting blurrier all the time? And how do we uphold human dignity when faced with conflict and chaos?
Those are the questions that will challenge you, inspire you, and ultimately shape how you see the law and its potential to create positive change.
Well said. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into IHL and IHRL. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, maybe even a little inspiring. Be sure to subscribe to LexTalks for more legal insights, and until next time, keep those legal minds sharp.